Welcome back, everyone, to our next presentation. I'm really happy to welcome next to me Emmanuel KATRAKIS from EuRIC. He will talk a little bit about the new CEAP in a post-crisis situation. And of course, that out of a recycler's perspective. He's the Secretary General of the European Recycling Industries Confederation. As I said, EuRIC, they are called. And yeah, he's responsible for the continuous development of that. But I don't want to tell you too much. Emmanuel, thank you so much for being here with us. It's your time, your stage. Tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Felix, for that very dynamic introduction. I'm also very pleased to be with you today, though virtually, because it seems to be the new norm, at least for the coming weeks. And I obviously would like to thank EuRIC for that series of webinar, which I think is extremely useful and interesting. And as Felix very shortly introduced, I'm going to speak about not an acronym, but a very important development for our industry, the new Circular Economy Action Plan. And obviously in relation to that, because that's that has had a huge impact and that still has an impact on our industry, the recycling industry, the impact of the COVID crisis and how we can basically connect the dots and the expectations between, on one hand, the situation in which we are as an industry and also with the value chains with whom we are working and serving, and on the other hand, the regulatory developments that we are witnessing at a pretty fast pace here in Brussels. I must say I had to give a title to my presentation 3 months ago or 2 months ago, if I remember well, and I thought that we would be in a post-crisis situation. I think it's still a question mark because be it in Europe or globally, we see that the supply chains have been very much disturbed. And though we see slight improvements over the last weeks and over summer, we are still in a situation for many material streams in which we are not at all to pre-crisis level with either a depressed demand and or depressed prices, which obviously do have major impacts on the recycling industry and beyond. Also, the other thing, and that's why I also share that with you, since there are a number of developments right now that I want to discuss today with you, is basically the impact of the circular economy and the Green Deal, or the potential impact on our industry, the practical problems that we are facing from a regulatory perspective today, and the potential solutions that we would like to see unfolding in the coming month. I would like that presentation to be as interactive as possible, so I plan to speak for more or less 25-30 minutes, and hopefully then I would welcome questions and answers. I will start, and I hope you can see my screen now that I'm trying to move on with my presentation. Oops. No. Yeah, okay. I will start by giving a very short introduction about EuRIC, who we are and what we do. I will then move to the circular economy, its concept that I'm sure you are all very much aware of, and then give an outlined version, I would say, of the main developments, be it the new circular economy package or the Green Deal, to then move on the key bottlenecks and the potential solutions. So EuRIC at a glance, we are a federation or confederation of federation and also of companies in Europe who are members of our association. We represent through our federations present across Europe 6,000 companies, from small and medium sized to the largest recycling companies in Europe, 300,000 local jobs which cannot be outsourced, million tons of waste which are being recycled every year into quality secondary raw materials, for an annual turnover of about 95 billion euros, which benefit the European economy. In terms of streams covered, which is pretty unique. We cover obviously metal recycling, plastics recycling, paper, e-waste, textiles, end of life, and tires. And we are structured in different branches to have both a very helicopter view of the issues that impact the recycling industry at large and a specific expertise via our specialized branches for all those different streams. I go very quickly through that, but I think it's also important. We are working with European institutions and also international organizations in a number of expert groups, if I may call it like them, dealing with a wide variety of issues which basically impact the industry, from the raw materials policy to sustainable finance, for instance, which is becoming increasingly important development, but also on standards which are relevant, be it quality standards or treatment standards for our industry. We also work a lot on eco-design for recycling and health, and thus we are also a member of a specialized group of the Commission, namely the Eco-Design and Energy Labeling Consultation Forum, dealing with eco-design of energy-related products. And we also work on trade-related issues. That's why we are also working in specific trade committees set up by the European institutions. I will stop there. The only thing I would like to say is that maybe some of you who are members of EuRIC are hearing that seminar today. I'd would like to thank all our experts, be them from Federation or from companies affiliated with our federations, who spend a lot of time for the benefit of the industry in those highly specific groups, highly technical and highly time consuming for the benefits of the industry at large. Now, I think it's always good to start a presentation about the circular economy before diving into the regulatory developments, about why we do that, why it's important, and why we can really not miss the target, if I may say. Just looking at the numbers, we see that the global middle class by 2030 is going to steadily increase quite a lot. And that's for sure. We already have constraints today, but that forces us as part of the industry at large to think about being more resource efficient. And I think recycling that perspective offers all the different types of benefits, simply because we turn waste into new recycled materials, which basically can substitute virgin materials in many instances. We are also extremely climate efficient, if I may say. I took here the example from the plastics strategy that was published 3 years ago by the European Commission, whereby using actually a life cycle assessment made by one of our members together with an environmental protection agency, the results show that recycling 1 million tons of plastics equal the CO2 emission savings from putting 1 million cars off the road. Stressing again the importance of being more circular, from obviously alongside with the waste hierarchy, the prevention side, to recycling obviously, and then the options down the waste hierarchy for waste which cannot be recycled. Now, we have seen over the last years a lot of developments about circular economy, and we are legitimate in thinking that the situation is improving. The overall situation is globally improving at European level, though there are a lot of obstacles which still impact our industry. But globally, we are far from being there. And though I'm not going to go in the mathematics of the report, I just want to show the headlines of the report, a report published in 2020, showing that when we make the comparison with the previous edition of that report, the global economy is not getting more circular, but is basically stagnating, if not decreasing in terms of circularity. Now, getting back to the priorities at European level, I think it's important to stress the developments that we have been witnessing since the new European Commission took over, and then put them into perspectives with the reality that our industry is facing today. Very interestingly, the first or among the very first communication that the new president of the Commission made once she took office, namely President Ursula von der Leyen, and please please apologize or accept my apologies if the pronunciation is not correct, was actually to put and publish the European Green Deal more or less a month after the new Commission took office, showing that alongside with digitalization, the green transition is this present Commission strategic priority, and making actually what we're going to discuss later on today not anymore an environmental policy as such, but a policy that is relevant for many other policies of the EU, be it obviously the raw materials policy, trade, and far beyond simply the ambit of what we have seen so far with the circular economy, limited or mostly focusing on environmental protection. I've put here the key objectives of the Green Deal. I will not go through all of them. I think one thing that is also interesting, and I know it goes far beyond waste management and recycling, is a lot of emphasis placed today on sustainable finance, which is also increasingly important because not only in terms of accessing finance, but also in terms of how sustainable activities will be classified in the near future. And that is related, for instance, to the taxonomy exercise that is being completed now following the publication of the regulation, and then the oncoming and overly important implementation work that will be done to basically define the criteria for sustainable activities and implement them in practice. I think we go to a step two, and step two has been the publication of the Circular Economy Action Plan. That happened more or less 3 months after the publication of the Green Deal. You may say it was it's a lot of time. I would say it has been a very fast action taken here, according to EU standards, having an overarching strategy published a month after taking office of the new Commission, or a month and a half, and then 3 months after having the new Circular Economy Action Plan being published, alongside with the new European Industrial Strategy that was published a day before, on the 10th of March. I'm not going to go through the entire, basically, new Circular Economy Action Plan. It's a 2.0 action plan, since the first one was published 4 or 5 years ago by the previous position, and again showing that that willingness to make that transition happen is a lasting one. What is more interesting for us are two things. I think first, the fact that for the first time the Commission in such a paper acknowledges the importance of recycled content targets. If we take a step back over the last 30 to 40 years, the waste management legislation, if I may say, which should actually be reliable, the resource management legislation, to connect the dots with the spirit of the circular economy, was very much oriented towards a push type of legislation. Namely, we are setting targets, we give predictability, obviously, to the industry, recycling targets, collection targets, and so forth and so on, but we don't care very much about the demand for secondary materials. I think the key element is that change, and I will be discussing that later, has been the Single-Use Plastics Directive, for which, and for the first time and for good reasons, the European Union decided to go beyond simply recycling targets, but set targets to incorporate recycled materials back into new product, and hence stimulate the demands when we see that the demand or that the environmental benefits generated by recycled materials are not properly priced by the market. The other thing that I think is extremely important in that document is the acknowledgement that we need to have a well-functioning EU market for secondary raw materials. One thing that we keep doing here at EuRIC, together with our member federation and companies, is to fight or combat, just to use a better word, too many disharmonized legislation among member states, which do basically hamper circular value chains, be them related to waste shipment, be them related to different harmonization when it comes to classification of waste, be them related to different understanding of what is a waste and what is not a waste. And I think that has been properly understood, that if we want to have a circular economy, we need more or less to apply the same recipe as it has been done with internal market, namely to have a well-functioning market for secondary materials. And to be frank, we are really far from there. That will be EuRIC, among EuRIC priorities #1 here. And one of those priorities would be to simplify waste shipment procedures. That has been also very much acknowledged in the new Circular Economy Action Plan. But I think that there is a strong focus here on intra-EU trade shipments. And I think we might potentially need in the future to put the global picture, because the recycling industry is extremely important for European value chains, but is competing on global commodity markets and needs a free and unhampered access to international markets as well. And I think that's equally important here. And again, last but not least, in that new Circular Economy Action Plan, we see a strong focus on product policy, eco-design for repair, reuse, and recycling. And that's, I think, equally important, simply because if we want, obviously, to be able to recover more materials, more valuable materials from end-of-life products, it's absolutely essential to be able, at the design stage, to bear in mind the end-of-life phase of those products, connect the dots between both, so basically having a better understanding of each other constraints, the constraints of the manufacturers, producers, and obviously the designers who produce those products, but also the constraints that we face as recyclers when we recycle those products. And I can give endless examples of designs for different types of products, be them packaging, be them complex products, electronics, or others whose very design hamper their recyclability at end-of-life phase, and for which we need both an enhanced collaboration with, alongside the value chain, and on the other hand, legislation to both place the right incentives and the right requirements to make sure that this happens in practice. Last but not least, and again, trying to give in a nutshell the key element of that Circular Economy Action Plan. One is the willingness of the Commission, and here I really try to make an outline of what the institution's key objectives are, is to have a toxic-free environment linked to the circular economy. And though we fully support the purpose, there are still a lot of question marks about the implementation in practice, and I will come back to that later on. And other, obviously, aspects in that action plan. What is interesting is the emphasis on key product value chains, either because they are strategic in terms of the materials they embody, or because, and actually often it's both, because of their environmental impacts, which are rather high, and for which more circularity would contribute to decrease. So here I really put my shoes and try to outline what are the key elements of the Circular Economy Action Plan, and put also in that slide what is very much in line with what we as an industry published before the publication of that action plan, which was basically full measures for the recycling industry, pool measures to stimulate the demand for recycled materials, a better functioning internal market for secondary materials, simplified procedure for waste shipments that we very much hope will become a reality with the revision of the waste shipment regulation, and a strong focus on product policy. I don't want to go too much into the details of the various directives which are being revised right now, because otherwise potentially I would need 2 hours, and during a lunch break I think I would be losing most of the audience. But I think what really changed completely the landscape has been obviously for all of us the COVID crisis, or the COVID pandemic and the crisis. It resulted with extremely sharp decrease in terms of GDP experienced during the second trimester of 2020. I've put here some numbers for spring 2020. I mean, the numbers by themselves have been appalling, and basically in practice, with a shutdown of large industries, automotive sector, the demand for raw materials and for secondary raw materials has been extremely depressed, and has very much, for most of the materials obviously, has very much impacted our industry. And despite the fact that we are by essence a highly resilient industry, it has been a tough time, and we are still trying to recover from that. A small parenthesis, if I may say, about guidelines that were that were published by the Commission during the crisis, mostly aiming at trying to keep the borders open for waste shipment across Europe. And I think that's also recognition that the services that as an industry we provide has been properly acknowledged as being essential, not only for the circular economy, but for society as a whole, and both for companies and obviously citizens across Europe. Now, and I think that's the last slide to present the landscape, I would say, in terms of circular economy and Green Deal. The EU has, as you all know, it's just switched on the radio, come up with an ambitious EU recovery plan. Ambitious in the sense that a lot of money will be made available in the coming years. There has been a renewed, let's say, prioritization of a green transition and a digital transition, and next to that, new financial instruments, for instance, without going into the instruments themselves or mechanism, the fact that for the first time the EU will be borrowing money on the financial markets. Well, when we spend money in any kind of entity, be it a company, a public organization, a state, we obviously need to look at how that will be reimbursed. And the European Union decided during a council that was lasted for quite some days in July to come up with own resources. And I think that's where I want to stop for a minute here. Two of those own new resources to be implemented in the coming years are related to a greener transition. One is on a non-recycled plastic waste-based contribution. We wonder quite a lot over the summer what is that contribution meaning. We do not have the full picture today. What we understand, because it's going to be pretty fast, is that it will be for each member state basically to come up with a system to contribute to the European budget on the amount of non-recycled plastic packaging waste, which will be calculated based on guidelines that Eurostat published recently. So it's not, and we've read that quite a lot, a taxation on non-recycled plastics. It will be for each member state basically to, put a system upon which the non-recycled plastic waste based will serve as a contribution to the European budget. To be frank, there are still a lot of question marks. Sorry for that. There are still a lot of question marks, and the practical impacts on the market cannot be assessed at least from our side right now, because it's now for each member state to come up with its own practical solution. There is a non-negligible risk, if I may say, that the solution will differ from one member state to another, which is never a good thing for us as an industry. We believe, especially when it comes to packaging, and that realistic but pragmatic but ambitious recycled content targets are major drivers in terms of driving the demand for recycled materials. Point number 2 is the carbon adjustment mechanism and the digital levy. I'm not going to go through the digital levy, but basically over the last years, we know that industry in Europe has been at a competitive disadvantage up to a certain extent among or against highly subsidized industries from abroad. And without going into the details whether it's good or not of the carbon adjustment mechanism, I think it's important to see that that would also be something that the Commission needs to put in place to basically contribute to the European budget, and also that would protect the industry, especially energy-intensive industries that do suffer from international competition. So all in all, what I wanted to say through that slide, now getting back to our own priorities or issues as an industry, is basically that among the two basically new own resources, the first two ones are very much related to the green agenda. And actually the third one as well. Now, I think, and that's what I want to say here, to get back more to the issues that the recycling industry has been facing, the COVID crisis has also acted as a reality check. Commodity prices have been falling, it's just a fact. Oil prices has been falling as well. And what we have seen is basically that both virgin polymer prices, a number of them, and recycled polymer prices have been falling alike, despite the fact that they have a completely different cost structure. The cost structure that we face, be it for plastic, metals, when we recycle, is obviously completely different from the cost structure for virgin materials. And what we saw is that resulted in two things. First, a sharp drop in prices that very much hurted here the plastics recycling industry, but many other recycling streams as well. And second, also, and that is here, if I may say, the reality check, the only stream for which basically we didn't experience a sharp drop in price and demand, and study one has been recycled PET for food grade, for food grade recycled PET, basically for which we see that the price level, and that's basically the chart here coming from ICIS, have been rather sustained, and that's actually thanks to partially or even to a great majority to recycled content targets set up under the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which has basically pushed already the supply chain as a whole to secure high-quality recycled PET. And for the first time, we saw that there was a decorrelation between the price of virgin materials and the price of recycled ones. Obviously, throughout the crisis, we issued a lot of press releases here about plastics, but also about other streams to raise awareness about the issues that our industry was facing. And I think I will stop here in relation to the new circular economy and Green Deal to get back to the obstacles and then the potential solutions. I think, and that's also a way to, because we could be far more granular in terms of the different streams, be them ELVs, be them electronic, be them packaging. I think as an industry as a whole, we suffer from a few obstacles, but which are lasting and major. First, there are a lot of studies that show how much CO2 and energy is being saved by using secondary materials. I've put two here studies, one made by the Fraunhofer Institute together with our German member BDSV, about the scrap bonus and how much alongside it's actually an excellent study that goes far beyond only the CO2 studies, but that looks at the economics of steel scrap and of the steel industry at large, but more or less using steel scrap in steel making processes basically generates, at least in 2018, for Europe, 157 million tons of CO2 savings for the recycling of 94 million tons of scrap, which is basically the equivalent in terms of CO2 savings of all the automobiles emissions circulating in France, Great Britain, and Belgium, in which obviously the traffic is rather dense. I put here another study, but that goes beyond simply steel scrap, and that goes and that encompasses the major raw materials, or secondary raw material streams made by the French Recycling Federation together with the French EPA, just to show and illustrate again that the CO2 savings that are being generated are huge. And the biggest problem that we face, and that was highlighted before, is the fact that those savings are simply not today internalized in the market prices. That's a huge market failure. And we believe that incentives that would reward those savings would not only benefit our industry, but would benefit the entire value chain, that would incentivize the use of more materials from recycling. Getting back to another obstacle, I think but I think here it's really important to illustrate what I was saying before about the lack of proper, well-functioning internal market for secondary material. I took here the example for recovered paper, whereby for a simple shipment complying with an harmonized standard that we have been working with together with the paper industry, so we speak about the same harmonized standard, that load is going to change status or can change status 3 to 4 times for a simple transboundary shipment between 2 neighboring countries. Here I took the example of the Netherlands with Germany, whereby we see that we have end-of-waste status that we strongly support between different countries, or actually even at regional level. But in the absence of harmonization at European level, what do we see is that the status keeps changing, and that actually put us not only adds a lot of red tape, but also a lot of legal uncertainty, in the sense that the qualification for those lack of harmonized rules among member states is also, legally speaking, a threat for the shipment, for the companies who are arranging the shipments. So I think here what we have been quite a lot, and sorry for changing too fast, advocating for, is for harmonized EU-wide end-of-waste criteria, not for all streams, but for the major streams, which would basically help in having a more level playing field, but also at rewarding quality as well, but also at facilitating exchange of secondary raw materials among member states. Point number, the last obstacle, if I may say, is the inadequate interface between, and I see time is running, waste, product, and chemicals legislation. I think here it's really urgent, because on one hand, we fully support the objective of having a safe circular economy. On the other hand, we really lack proper tools, both in terms of proper classification of waste. Waste is intrinsically heterogeneous, and we are also taking criteria which are criteria stemming from the product legislation, CLP legislation, for instance, that may trigger classification as hazardous waste, reclassification as hazardous waste of waste streams which do not pose any risk, with major consequences in terms of circularity. And I think here, and I will get back to that later, be it in terms of criteria to classify waste, but also in terms of how we are setting thresholds and the pace at which legislation had been changed, we really need to make further progress in order to give a sufficient certainty the waste management and recycling industry needs here to further invest into recycling processes and also better understand the constraints of circular value chains. I take here the example of persistent organic pollutants. We all agree they need to be regulated. The problem that we see here, and there are quite a lot, is that there are changes occurring every 2 years with basically thresholds that are being proposed, which would have major impacts depending on the ones that will be finally agreed. And here we believe that we need to have a more fact-based approach and also avoid changing legislation overly fast to give the certainty the industry needs to make proper and quality recycling, and here mostly to when it comes to thermoplastics from electronic or ELVs. I could speak about that for quite some time, so I'm going to stop here because I think it's not to stop here my presentation, but about waste and chemicals, and potentially get back to that later. Now, in terms of solutions, when it comes obviously to the lack of internationalization and the need to stimulate in markets, we have been strongly supporting as EuRIC market-based instruments, either reduced VAT market-based instrument and fiscal-based instruments to reward the use of recycled materials in value chains and reward those energy and CO2 savings to stimulate the demand. Mandatory green public procurement to make sure that the 14% of GDP that is basically captured by public procurement also contributes basically to that green transition. And here we really need to make progress on having a mandatory green public procurement criteria to reward circular products that are using recycled materials and that are also easier to reuse when they reach enough light. And not for all streams, but for streams for which that's a very important and proven solution, as we have seen here with packaging, binding recycled content targets. We today as EuRIC are very much basically supporting the inclusion of recycled content targets within the revision of the end-of-life vehicles directives for technical plastics, not only because it will help the industry, but because we know working and representing the companies who are already supplying high-quality technical plastics to the automotive industry and working and having also been in contact with automotive manufacturers, that the leading ones in that respect are already available to meet those targets, and we need to move out from the exception to the rule and make sure that we will stimulate the demand that way. Well-functioning market for secondary materials, and I will still need 3 minutes to conclude. I've said that simpler and faster waste shipment procedures which rely on electronic procedures. Increasingly, we are in the 21st century. We can no longer afford to have notification procedures that are still using paper-based type of procedures and be so long. So we need here faster, simpler, and more harmonized procedures. Harmonized EU waste, EU and national end of waste criteria, especially for recovered paper and entire derived rubber materials. And something that I think is important, work towards the creation of a new status for secondary materials to move away from the dichotomy we see today with the huge consequences between waste and products, and give the proper status that we deserve as an industry in relation to the objective of the circular economy. I think last but not least, I still have 2 slides to come. I think I mentioned that before, improving the interface. I think that's absolutely crucial. We need to define an approach where we are not looking at the substance itself, but at the real risk it poses depending on the materials in which it's encapsulated, and also have a very holistic approach to that, promote eco-design at design stage, phase out substances of very high concern, but also look at alternatives to make sure they are, if there is any risk that they become substances of concern in the future, also that they can be separated in recycling processes. That's absolutely crucial, either the one that we have today or the one in which innovation is waiting for tomorrow. And I think that's really one of the key, if not the key, of the circular economy, to have a much better interface between those legislation and stop having major risks with a lot of work that problem that we are facing today in terms of risk of reclassification and ever-changing thresholds. And that's really crucial because as an industry, we really need certainty. We published a brochure here, so I think for more information about our vision, I will strongly advise you to get back to our brochure. And I want to conclude with the absolute need to improve design. And I think here now we have the right toolbox. It's just that we need to go faster, deeper. And I think that the toolbox that we have is first, obviously using the existing regulations, eco-design regulation, to also go beyond energy efficiency as it's already the case, and look really at, in terms of material efficiency, which are the hurdles to more recovery. And I can show you plenty of examples about the work we are doing for different types of products to basically try to improve the recyclability of those different types of products because of additives which are being added in the materials, or because of the very design and the way materials are being glued or welded together. Also, in terms of how we are going to communicate to consumers products which are easier and more circular, easier to recycle with recycled content, and which are also easier to repair when they reach end of life stage. We also need to play on incentives. I just put here the eco-modulation of fees, with a lot of work to be done now. Work is being done in terms of packaging to basically set out the criteria, but not only for packaging, obviously, to define what is recyclability and how we could modulate fees based on the recyclability of the products which are being placed on the market. Cooperation is absolutely crucial. I here put the example of Polyce, which is a project putting together the electronics value chain to try to improve the circularity of plastics in electronics, both from a manufacturing designer perspective and from a recycler's perspective, and obviously, as I mentioned, proper labeling. To conclude, and I know actually I take too much time, we are publishing quite a lot of positions and documents. We publish a survey on battery fires, which is another major issue for the industry, which is available online. We will continue that work with our partners in the coming a month, and also brochures about key streams or the priorities that we have as an industry. Thank you, and sorry for having spoken so long. I hope it was clear enough for the audience.
Well, Emmanuel, thank you so much for being here, for giving us that very complete presentation. So good to have such a nice overview of what we have to do, what the steps are to really reach that circular economy. And thank you for your positions on the different things that are not working at the moment, and we will have to work on in the near future to reach that. Very nice. We've got a few more minutes left for any questions, so feel free to post them through the question panel here in GoToWebinar. You find it on the right, and with the speech bubble with a little question mark. One more thing I was asking myself when I had a look at your presentation, Emmanuel, was do you think these things will have to come from a political side? You were talking about a few things, of course, standards, as well as you proposed some taxes as well. Do you think we will have to do more from a political standpoint, or is that something that will have to happen from a business standpoint?
I think it's both, because there are a lot of expectations that have been expressed and set by policymakers now for years, actually, but that have been renewed. And as I mentioned, that go far beyond basically the scope of the waste management and recycling policy. But on the other hand, we really need to bridge the knowledge gap, because what we saw, and I haven't been talking too much about that so far, at least in my presentation, is that if we want really to have a better design for recycling, we need both to have a better cooperation with the entire value chain on one hand, and also make sure that the policymaker do very precisely understand the constraints that we face as an industry when it comes to end-of-life recovery. The same applies to the lack of interface between waste and chemicals. Today, we are caught on a number of regulatory changes that could really put an end to circular value chains. And here again, we very much and strongly support the fact that when we speak about the circular economy, it's absolutely essential to make sure that hazardous substances are not finding their way back into recycled materials. But we have not defined an approach to know what is a hazard and what is not. And we don't know basically the methodology that has to be used here. And I think that's really a pity, because on one hand, we as an industry have made a lot of efforts, our companies are investing a lot. On the other hand, we keep seeing very often actually regulatory changes that could really put an end to well-functioning circular value chains. And I think this is where we need to have a better understanding, together with both policymakers and NGOs, of what are the reality of the constraints that we do have, be it with legacy substances in durable products, so basically substances that were placed in products which are today no longer allowed, be it in terms of the risks they actually pose depending on the materials and the end uses in which they are found. And I think that's really absolutely essential, because this is how we can connect the dots between the expectations to have a more circular economy and the industrial reality. That's what I wanted to say here. When it comes to the incentives, we need to use the incentives depending on the market failure we aim at tackling. That's why we don't see as EuRIC we need to have recycled content for all type of materials, but for certain ones we need. For others, we need other type of incentives to make sure that when investments are being made to scale up capacity in Europe and beyond, priority and bonuses will be given to value chains increasingly relying on secondary materials.
Totally, thank you for that, of course. All right, our time's nearly up. One more thing, Emmanuel, do you have some contact data, or where can we reach you and your team if we have any further questions, want more information, etc., etc.?
I'll make sure, I mean, I can put them in the chat box and you can share them, but otherwise you go on our website, there is a contact page, and you write us an email and we will respond. We are open to all types of requests. Otherwise, you can just email us at EuRIC, then -aisbl.eu, but all those contact details are on our website, and I will make sure that they are also in the presentation that I'm sure will be distributed to the participants.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here. Do you have any last words to end that presentation?
I would really like to thank you and also EuRIC and MSV for putting together those highly informative online conferences. I think that's a very important way to connect us, because we are missing having meetings, conferences in person, and still try to keep virtually contact with our industry and the value chains with whom we are working. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for being a part of that. And yeah, it's really fun through the whole online conference, because I got you sitting in Belgium yesterday. I was talking to John sitting in the US, to Edward sitting in Australia, and all around the world people are coming together. And thank all of you participating here, and have a good day. See you in the next presentation. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.